The summer Evelyn Mercer turned 31, she learned that grief and debt were first cousins, that one rarely came without dragging the other through the door. Thomas Mercer had been dead for 6 weeks when the letters started arriving. Not letters of condolence, though a few of those came too, written in the careful cursive of church women who knew how to say we're so sorry without actually doing anything about it. These were different letters. They came in envelopes with official seals, with numbers written in ink so bold they seemed to press through the paper, as if the debt itself wanted to be felt in the fingertips. $40 owed to Hendricks Grain, $62 to the feed supply in Colby, $117 to the First Bank of Harlan Creek, where a man named Gerald Fitch had a brass nameplate on his desk and no patience for widows. Thomas had borrowed quietly. That was the thing Evelyn kept turning over in those early weeks while she lay awake listening to the Kansas wind scrape against the window glass. He had borrowed and said nothing, the way men of his generation believed that financial trouble was a private humiliation, something to be solved before the wife found out. And if it couldn't be solved, then at least she wouldn't know about it until the very end. The very end had come faster than either of them expected. Thomas took sick in June, a fever that settled in his lungs with the stubbornness of something that had decided to stay. By July 4th, he couldn't stand without holding the door frame. By the 19th, he was gone. He was 34 years old. He had calloused hands and a laugh that started in his chest before it reached his face, and he had loved Evelyn in the uncomplicated, solid way that some men manage. Not poetic, not elaborate, but present. Reliable. She had never once doubted that he would come home. That was the cruelest part of it. She had spent 9 years never once doubting, and then one morning she woke up and he simply wasn't there anymore. And the silence where his breathing had been was so loud it felt like it had a weight. She had 3 children. Silas was 7, the eldest, a boy with his father's jaw, and a personality that seemed to have arrived already formed. Stubborn, watchful, and quietly furious at anything he couldn't fix. He had taken the news of his father's death by going out to the barn alone and staying there for 4 hours. Evelyn had not gone after him. Some grief needed room. Clara was 5. She had Evelyn's dark eyes and a tendency to collect small objects, smooth stones, a bent spoon, a blue button she'd found in the road, and carry them in her apron pockets with the gravity of someone transporting valuables. She had asked, twice, when Papa was coming back. The second time, she seemed to understand from Evelyn's face alone that he wasn't, and she had simply reached into her pocket, found her blue button, and held it in her fist for the rest of the afternoon without saying another word. The baby, Henry, was 18 months and understood nothing except that the house felt different. He had started waking at night again, a habit he'd outgrown at 10 months, and Evelyn would walk him in the dark kitchen, her feet finding the familiar cold floorboards, until he settled. She had tried to hold things together. God knew she had tried. She took on washing for Mrs. Adler on Mill Street, hauling the basket the quarter-mile each way, her arms aching by the time she got back. She sold the 2 pigs Thomas had been raising. She sent Silas to help at the Whitmore farm on Saturdays for 50 cents a day, which felt like something between practical necessity and a particular kind of heartbreak. A 7-year-old boy giving up his Saturdays because his father was gone. Silas never complained. That almost made it worse. But the numbers didn't stop arriving, and the numbers were patient in a way that Evelyn was not. And by late August, it was clear that what she had managed to scrape together was not enough. Not close to enough. Gerald Fitch from the bank came to her door on a Thursday morning. He wore his good coat even though it was 90 degrees, and he stood on her porch with his hat in his hands in a way that was meant to look respectful, but mostly looked like procedure. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I want you to know I take no pleasure in this." "Then don't do it," she said. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had divided the world cleanly into what he wanted to do and what the numbers required him to do, and had long ago made his peace with the division. "The property will go to auction," he said. "Friday next. I'm sorry." He put his hat back on and walked back to his horse, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched him go and did not move for a long time. Friday next came with the particular cruelty of beautiful weather. The sky over Harlan Creek was the deep, cloudless blue that Kansas sometimes produced in late summer, the kind of sky that painters would have wept at, enormous and indifferent. The heat was dry and sharp. By 8 in the morning, the auction block, which was really just the raised wooden platform outside the county building on Main Street, used for everything from property sales to town announcements, was already surrounded by people. Evelyn had dressed carefully. She was not sure why. There was some instinct in her, some stubborn last nerve that refused to let her appear in front of these people looking broken. She wore her good dress, the dark blue one with the cream collar that she had sewn herself 3 winters ago. And she had done her hair properly, and she had made sure the children were clean. Silas in his good shirt, Clara with her hair braided, though one braid was already starting to work itself loose in the heat. Henry on her hip, solid and warm, chewing on his fist with great concentration. She knew most of the faces in that crowd. That was what made it what it was. There was Mrs. Calloway from the dry goods store, who had given Evelyn credit once and was owed $11. There was Holtbreeder, no relation to the trade despite the name, who ran the grain supply and whose letters had been the coldest. There were neighbor farmers, men who had worked land beside Thomas for years, standing at the edges of the crowd with expressions that ranged from sympathetic to plainly curious. There were people she recognized from church, from the market, from 9 years of living in this town. Not one of them had come to help her. She understood, in the dry, pragmatic way that crisis had made her pragmatic, that this was how it went. People were not monstrous. They were simply people, which was almost the same thing. They had their own debts and their own fears and their own families, and watching someone else go under was a reminder that the water was deep for everyone. So they watched. They didn't help, but they watched, which was at least a kind of witnessing. There was one man she did not recognize. He was at the far edge of the crowd, sitting on his horse rather than standing on the ground like everyone else, which gave her a slightly elevated view of him. Not that she was looking. She noticed him only because he wasn't moving, wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't doing the small social things that people did in crowds. He was just watching. He wore a trail coat the color of old leather and a hat pulled low against the sun, and the horse beneath him was a large gray animal with a calm, sensible look about it. She noticed him and then put him out of her mind because Gerald Fitch had climbed the platform and was clearing his throat with the official sound of a man who had somewhere else to be. "Good morning," Fitch said, though the morning was not particularly good. "We are here today to settle the estate of the late Thomas Mercer, pursuant to debts outstanding as filed with the county. The property at question includes—" Evelyn stopped listening. She knew what the property included. She had lived on it. She had shaped her hands around the handles of every tool in that barn, had pressed seeds into that soil, had painted the kitchen door herself one spring afternoon while Silas chased a chicken around the yard and Clara supervised from the fence post and Thomas stood in the doorway with his coffee and laughed. She knew every inch of what was about to be read aloud as a list of assets. What she had not expected was what came next. Fitch was reading through the terms when a different voice cut across the crowd. Not loud exactly, but carrying, the kind of voice accustomed to being heard over wind and distance. "What about the children?" The crowd shifted. Evelyn looked up. It was a man named Corbin Dale who had spoken. She recognized him now. A rancher from out past Miller's Creek. A big man with a red face and the slow, self-satisfied look of someone who had always had more than he needed. He was standing near the front of the crowd, arms folded, looking at Evelyn with an expression she did not like. "The Mercer boy," Dale said, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd with the ease of habit. "I heard he's a hard worker. I could use a hard worker." The air went out of the morning. Evelyn understood in a flooding, terrible rush exactly what was happening. She had heard of it, in territories and desperate places, when estates were settled and widows couldn't pay, the practice of indenturing children as workers to clear a parent's debt. It was legal. It was not common in Harlan Creek, but it was legal. And Corbin Dale, standing there with his arms folded and his red face, was looking at her 7-year-old boy with the calculating eyes of a man doing arithmetic. Silas, standing beside her, had gone absolutely still. "That is not—" Evelyn started, but her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Mrs. Mercer." Fitch's voice was not unkind, but it was professional. "The debt must be satisfied. There has to be another seat." "I'll take the boy," Dale said. He wasn't asking, he was announcing. "Clear her account. Keep him through his 16th year. That's fair." 16. The word came out of Evelyn's mouth like something physical. "He's 7 years old." 9 years of work, Dale said. "That's fair trade for what she owes." The crowd was very quiet. Evelyn could feel the weight of all those faces on her, and the heat, and Henry's small fist clutching the fabric at her shoulder, and she could feel Silas pressed against her side. Not clinging, not exactly, because Silas didn't cling, but close. Close in the way of a child who understood without understanding that something was very wrong. "He's my son," Evelyn said. She said it clearly. She met Corbindale's eyes when she said it. She wanted there to be no question about what she was saying, not as a legal argument, not as a negotiating position, but as a simple fact she was laying in front of all of them like a stone. "He is my son." Dale shrugged, which was the most infuriating possible response. "The girl could go to Meredith Holt," someone said from deeper in the crowd. She couldn't see who. "She's been wanting a house girl. Clara." They were talking about Clara. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not panic. She had been in the territory of panic for days and had moved through it, and out the other side into something colder and more dangerous. It was a kind of terrible clarity. She stood on that sun-baked platform in her good blue dress, with her baby on her hip, and her children pressed against her, and she understood, with absolute precision, the geometry of what was happening. They were going to take her children apart from her. One to Dale, one to Holt, and Henry, 18 months old, still waking in the night, would go to some institution or charitable home because nobody would take a baby for work. She looked down at Silas. He was looking up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not fear. Silas didn't show fear, or had decided not to, at 7 years old, in the way that some children make that decision and keep it. What was on his face was something closer to a question. A furious, burning question directed at the world and at her and at the general situation of everything. "Are you going to let this happen?" She didn't know. She honestly didn't know. Fitch was talking again. Something procedural? Something about the formal recording of offers. And Dale was saying something about papers. And the crowd was shifting in that unconscious way, crowd shift, when they sensed things moving toward a conclusion. Evelyn held Henry tighter and tried to think, and found, for the first time in 6 weeks of hard, desperate, practical thinking, that she had reached the end of her thoughts. There was nothing left. She had worked every angle, turned every stone, and there was nothing left but this platform, and this sun, and these people who had known her for 9 years and were about to watch her family be divided like property. It was in that exact moment, that specific pocket of silence between Fitch drawing breath and Dale opening his mouth again, that a new voice entered the situation. "I'll cover it." The voice came from the left side of the crowd. Not loud, not theatrical, but absolutely certain. The kind of voice that didn't raise itself because it had never needed to. The crowd turned. The man on the gray horse had moved forward. He was closer now, close enough that Evelyn could see him properly. Late 30s, she would have guessed, with a face that had been outside for most of its life. Brown from sun with lines at the corners of the eyes that came from squinting into distance. He wore trail dust on his coat like he hadn't stopped to brush it off, and he sat the horse with the particular ease of a man who spent more time mounted than not. He was not handsome in any deliberate way. He was simply there, present and unhurried, in the middle of a situation that everyone else was making complicated. "I'll cover the debt," he said again. He looked at Fitch, not at Dale. "All of it. In full. Gold." The crowd had gone very quiet in a different way than before. Fitch stared at him. "And who are you?" "Rowan Vale. I run a horse outfit about 40 miles northwest of here, past the Calico Ridge." He reached into his coat and produced something, a leather wallet, well worn, and held it up briefly. "I've got the gold to cover what she owes. I'd want a receipt." "Mr. Vale," Dale's voice had taken on a new texture, something harder. "This isn't your business." "A man can pay a debt if he likes," Rowan Vale said. He looked at Dale for the first time, and the look was not aggressive, not exactly, but it was clear in the way that a door being closed is clear. "That's generally how debts work." "And what do you want in return?" Dale said. He looked at Evelyn when he said it, and the implication in his look was plain enough to make the women in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Rowan Vale followed Dale's look to Evelyn and then looked back at Dale with an expression of pure, steady patience. "I need hands for my ranch," he said. "I've got a working household that's short. Mrs. Mercer and her children would come work for me. Wages. Proper wages, not indenture." He paused. All four of them, together, the crowd murmured. Evelyn was looking at him. She was trying to read him the way she had learned to read people in 9 years of frontier life. The small tells, the off notes, the things people showed in how they held themselves when they thought they were just standing in a crowd. He was not looking at her the way Dale had looked at her. He was not performing anything for the crowd. He was sitting on his horse with his hands loose on the reins, watching Fitch, waiting. "I don't know you," Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her then, brown eyes, unhurried. "No, ma'am, you don't." "You'd pay $200 and some for people you don't know." "I'd pay a debt to keep a family together," he said, "and I'd be getting good workers for my trouble, or so I'd expect." "And if we don't suit your expectations?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Then we'd work that out." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Corbin Dale, who was watching this exchange with the expression of a man whose arithmetic had just been disrupted. She looked at Fitch, who was clearly working through the legal angles. She looked down at Silas, who was looking up at the man on the gray horse with that same burning, furious attention he gave to everything he was trying to understand. She looked at her children. Clara had reached into her apron pocket and was holding her blue button. Henry was watching the gray horse with enormous, uncomplicated interest. Silas met her eyes. What passed between them in that moment was not words and not really a decision. It was more like an acknowledgement between a mother and a 7-year-old boy that the world had put them somewhere neither of them had chosen, and they were going to have to find their way through it together, and the only choice available right now was the one that kept them in the same place. "All right," Evelyn said. She was not sure, in that moment, whether she was making the best decision of her life or the worst one. She suspected she might not know for a long time. What she knew was this. They were going to leave together, all four of them, on a stranger's word toward a place she had never seen, into a life she couldn't picture. And whatever came next, whatever labor or hardship or new shape of difficulty waited 40 miles northwest past the Calico Ridge, it would come for them as a family. Corbin Dale said something else. She stopped listening to him. Gerald Fitch produced papers, and Rowan Vale produced gold coins that caught the sun with a plain, blunt honesty, and the crowd watched and talked among themselves in the low voice that crowds use when the spectacle has shifted from the expected to the surprising. Evelyn held Henry on her hip and felt Silas take her free hand, quietly, without being asked, in the matter-of-fact way he had of doing necessary things. And she stood in the heat of that August morning and watched a stranger pay for her freedom with metal money and a calm face. And she did not know what to feel, except that she refused to feel grateful until she understood what she had agreed to. She was not naive. She had never been naive. But she was standing upright. She was still holding her children. And for right now, in this exact and fragile moment, that was enough. The wagon Rowan Vale had brought was a working wagon, not a settler's covered prairie schooner, but a sturdy flatbed with a bench seat up front and high wooden sides, the kind used for hauling supplies over rough country. There was feed in the back, a canvas tarpaulin folded against the sideboards, and a second horse tied at the rear, a brown mare with patient eyes. He helped load their things without being asked about it and without making ceremony of it. That was something Evelyn noted. He was not trying to be impressive. He lifted the trunk she pointed at, asked whether the smaller box went too, and when she said yes, he put it in without comment. He did not make conversation while they loaded. He did not try to sell her on anything. He just worked. Silas watched him the whole time. When the wagon was loaded and Evelyn had settled Clara and Henry in the back on the folded canvas, she climbed up to the bench seat and found Rowan Vale already there, reins in hand, looking straight ahead down the road out of Harlan Creek. She sat beside him. There was a foot of space between them on the bench. "I don't know what you expect from this arrangement," she said, as the wagon began to move. "An honest day's work," he said, "from whoever can give it. And when the debt's worked off, then you're free to go or stay as you choose." She looked at the side of his face. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you didn't fall apart back there when you had reason to," he said. "That tells me something." She turned and looked back at the town of Harlan Creek, shrinking behind them, the platform still standing in the morning sun, the crowd already dispersing, people going back to their ordinary days. Gerald Fitch was folding his papers. Corbin Dale had turned away. 9 years of her life. Thomas's grave in the churchyard. The kitchen door she had painted green herself one spring. She turned back around. The road ahead was long and pale and unfamiliar, running northwest through grassland that rolled and shimmered in the heat. "Your ranch," she said. "What's it called?" "Vales," he said, in the tone of a man who had not spent much time on the naming of things. "How many people work it?" "3 hands, woman who does cooking, older than your grandmother likely, a boy of about 14 who doesn't talk much." He glanced at her sideways. "And now 4 more." Evelyn absorbed this. The wagon rolled. Henry had fallen asleep on the canvas. Clara was already looking at a small stone she'd found in the wagon bed, holding it up to the light with the focused pleasure of a naturalist. Silas was sitting with his back against the sideboards, watching the prairie pass, his expression unreadable. "He'll give you trouble," Evelyn said, nodding toward her eldest. "He doesn't like new things." Rowan Vale glanced back at Silas. Silas, sensing the look, stared back with flat, unconcealed assessment. "I don't need him to like new things," Rowan said. "I need him to work. Liking comes later. Or it doesn't." Evelyn looked ahead down the road. It was not, she thought, a comforting thing to say. But it was honest. And after 6 weeks of letters and numbers, and men who said they took no pleasure in things, and then did them anyway, honesty had a quality that she was not prepared to dismiss. The wagon moved northwest through the hard Kansas summer, carrying everything she had left in the world. 3 children, a trunk, a small box, and enough uncertainty to fill the sky. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she did not look back at Harlan Creek again. The road northwest out of Harlan Creek ran straight for the first 8 miles, then forgot itself. It bent around a dry creek bed, climbed a low rise, and dissolved into 2 uncertain tracks pressed into the prairie grass by years of wagon wheels that had eventually stopped coming. Rowan Vale followed those tracks without hesitation, which told Evelyn he had made this journey many times and no longer needed the road to be obvious. She had been watching him drive for 3 hours and had learned a few things. He handled the reins with minimal effort, the way people handle things they've done so long that the body takes over from the mind. He didn't whistle or talk to the horses or narrate the landscape the way some men did when silence made them nervous. The silence didn't seem to make him nervous at all. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees, the leather reins loose in his fingers, and watched the country ahead with the steady, patient attention of a man who understood that prairie could change its mood without warning and preferred to see it coming. He had offered her water from a canteen around midday, passing it across without comment, and she had taken it and passed it back, and that had been the extent of their conversation for a considerable stretch of time. Clara had fallen asleep across Henry in the wagon bed, the 2 of them tangled together in the unself-conscious way of small children who had not yet learned to keep their bodies to themselves. Silas had not slept. Silas sat with his back against the sideboards and watched the prairie, and occasionally watched Rowan Vale with the measuring expression of someone compiling a case. It was Silas who broke the silence first, which surprised Evelyn. He generally preferred to reach his conclusions privately before announcing them. "You paid a lot of money," Silas said. He directed this at Rowan Vale's back. Rowan glanced over his shoulder. "I did." "Why?" A pause. "I needed workers." "There were other workers you could have hired, ones that didn't cost that much." Rowan turned back to the road. "There were." Silas waited for more. More did not come. He tried a different angle, the way he always did when a direct approach didn't work. Evelyn had watched him do this since he was 4 years old, the methodical persistence of a boy who treated every problem as a puzzle with a solution that could be found if you just kept looking. "Did you know my father?" "No." "Did you know my mother before today?" "No." "Then why us?" Rowan Vale was quiet for long enough that Evelyn thought he might not answer. The wagon rolled over a patch of rough ground, and she grabbed the bench edge, and Henry stirred in the back and resettled without waking. "Because that man Dale was going to take you," Rowan said finally. His voice was the same as it had been all morning, level, without decoration. "And I've seen what happens to boys who go to men like Dale. I didn't want to see it again." Silas absorbed this. He looked at the back of Rowan's head, then at his mother, then back at the horizon. Whatever calculation he was running, it didn't produce an immediate output. He folded his arms across his chest and went back to watching the prairie, and Evelyn went back to watching Rowan Vale, and the wagon continued northwest through the afternoon heat. She was not softened by what he'd said. She noted it the way she noted all information, carefully, without deciding yet what it meant. A man could say a decent thing and still want something indecent in return. She had been raised on the frontier, and she was not romantic about the nature of people. What she was watching for was the gap between what he said and what he did, because people were almost always consistent in that gap, and it usually showed itself within the first day. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon, when the sun had dropped to the angle where it turned the grassland copper and threw long shadows east. She saw the fence line first. Good fence, she noticed, straight posts set at proper intervals, wires strung taut. Then the outbuildings, a barn, and two smaller structures, and then the house itself, low and long, built from wood that had weathered to gray, with a porch running along the front and a water pump visible at the side yard. It was not beautiful. It was functional in the plain, unargued way of things built for survival rather than appearance. But the fence was good, and the yard was clear of debris, and the barn doors were hanging straight on their hinges, which told her more about the man who ran the place than any amount of conversation would have. A woman came out of the house as the wagon pulled in. She was, as Rowan had suggested, old, somewhere between 65 and 70, small and angular, with white hair pulled back tight and an expression of concentrated appraisal that she turned on Evelyn and the children with the thoroughness of someone taking inventory. "This is May Sutton," Rowan said. "She runs the household." "I see he brought more than supplies," May said. She was looking at the children with what appeared to be resigned acceptance rather than warmth. "How many?" "3 children," Evelyn said. "Silas is 7. Clara is 5. The baby is Henry." "Henry?" May looked at the baby, who was awake now and staring at her with round, unblinking eyes. Something shifted in her expression very briefly before it went back to neutral. "He's young." "Yes." "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you do it without being told how?" "I've been cooking since I was 12 years old," Evelyn said. May looked at her for another moment, then made a small sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement, but seemed to file the information away. She turned and went back into the house, and that was the introduction. The 3 ranch hands were a different matter. 2 of them, brothers named Cal and Pete Doss, came from the direction of the barn and stood at a distance watching the wagon unload with the careful neutrality of men who had learned that new arrivals on a ranch could mean a great variety of things, and it was better to wait before forming an opinion. They were both lean and dark-haired, Cal the elder by a few years, and they nodded to Evelyn in turn and said nothing beyond their names. The third was the boy Rowan had mentioned, the one who didn't talk much. His name was Danny, and he was 14, with a thin, angular face and eyes that had the distant quality of someone who spent most of their time somewhere other than the immediate conversation. He looked at Silas with the frank assessment of someone who had been the youngest person on the property for some time and was already adjusting his internal arithmetic. Silas looked back with equal frankness. "Are you fast?" Danny asked. Silas blinked. "At what?" "Anything." Silas considered this as a serious question, which it apparently was. "I don't know," he said. "I never had much to compare to." Danny nodded as if this were a reasonable and sufficient answer, and went back to work, and that was apparently that. Rowan showed Evelyn the room where she and the children would sleep, a room at the back of the house, separated from the main hall by a door that latched from the inside, which she noted with private relief. It was plain, 2 narrow beds and a pallet that could be laid on the floor, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out on the back of the barn. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable. She had slept in worse. "Supper is at 6, Rowan said from the doorway. "You don't have to do anything tonight. Start in the morning." "I'd rather be useful now," she said. He looked at her. "You've been sitting on a wagon all day with 3 children." "I'm aware of what I've been doing." A beat. "Suit yourself," he said, and walked away down the hall. She stood in the room with her trunk and her children, in the particular silence of a place that had its own rhythms she had not yet learned, and she let herself, just for a moment, feel how exhausted she was. It moved through her like something physical, from her feet up, the weeks of debt letters and sleepless nights, and the auction block and the long wagon ride, and the unknown that was still stretching ahead of her with no visible end. She let herself feel it. Then she put it away, the way she had been putting things away for 6 weeks, in the locked room at the back of herself that she was trying very hard not to open. She went to find May Sutton and asked what needed doing for supper. The first week was about learning the shape of the place. The ranch ran horses, not cattle, which surprised her, though she wasn't sure why she had assumed cattle. Rowan Vale bred and trained working horses, the kind sold to ranches and cavalry and freight operations across the territory, and the pastures held perhaps 40 animals in various stages of training. The work was constant and specific. Horses required attention in a way that cattle mostly didn't. Individual attention, the kind that required you to understand each animal separately, its particular fears and habits and the things that would make it trust you and the things that wouldn't. Rowan spent most of his days outside. She would see him from the kitchen window, in the paddock with one horse or another, doing the slow, repetitive work of getting an animal to accept a saddle or a bit or a rider. He was patient in a way that some men only managed with animals, and she watched him sometimes without meaning to, the way you watch something that contradicts your expectations just long enough to figure out why. Her own work was the household. She and May divided it without much discussion. May had her systems, and Evelyn had hers, and they were not identical, and the first few days had the particular friction of two competent women trying to share a kitchen without either of them managing to entirely yield. May salted her beans differently. Evelyn thought May's bread was too dense. Neither of them said this directly. They worked around each other with the careful choreography of people who understood that a running household was more important than being right. And gradually, without anything being declared, a working arrangement emerged. Clara attached herself to May with a speed that surprised everyone, including May. On the third morning, Evelyn came into the kitchen to find Clara standing on a step stool beside May at the work counter, watching the older woman's hands with the concentrated attention she usually reserved for her collection of small objects. May was explaining something about how to tell when dough was ready, and she was explaining it in the flat, unsentimental way she did everything, without softening her voice or slowing her words, and Clara was absorbing it with enormous seriousness. May glanced up and saw Evelyn in the doorway. Her expression didn't change. She looked back at the dough. She asked, May said. It was not an apology or an explanation. It was just a fact. I know she did, Evelyn said. Henry was the complication. At 18 months, he required a kind of constant low-level attention that didn't fit neatly into any work schedule, and Evelyn spent the first 2 weeks in a state of divided focus that left her more tired at the end of each day than the work itself justified. She set him in a basket near the kitchen when she was cooking. She brought him outside when the weather permitted, where he sat in the dirt with the seriousness of a scientist conducting experiments on soil composition. She nursed him in the early mornings before anyone else was up, in the half-dark of the back room, and in those quiet minutes she let herself miss Thomas in a way that she couldn't afford to miss him during the day. She did not cry. Or rather, she cried once, in the third week, in the barn alone for about 4 minutes, and then she wiped her face on her sleeve and went back to work, because the grief was real, but so was the work. And the work was the thing she could actually do something about. Silas had a harder time. He was not unkind to anyone on the ranch, not exactly. He did his work without complaint. Rowan had set him to helping Danny with small tasks, carrying water to the paddock, filling the grain bins, fixing the sections of fence that the horses tested regularly. He did all of this competently and without being asked twice. But he held himself at a particular distance from Rowan Vale that was deliberate in a way Evelyn recognized, because she was doing a version of the same thing, though she was better at concealing it. One evening in the second week, she came out to find Silas sitting on the porch steps alone after supper. He had his knees up and his arms around them, and he was looking at the paddock where Rowan was doing a final check on the horses in the last of the evening light. She sat down beside him. They watched Rowan move along the fence line, pausing at each animal, running a hand along a neck, checking a leg, just looking. He works a lot, Silas said. He does, Evelyn agreed. Does he sleep? I expect so. Silas was quiet for a moment. Danny says he's fair, says he never hits any of them. The horses? Or the hands? Danny said the man who had the place before wasn't like that. Evelyn looked at her son's profile in the evening light. 7 years old, his father's jaw, his own eyes, which had always been older than the rest of him. That's good information, she said carefully. I know. He picked at a splinter on the porch step. It doesn't mean I trust him. No, she agreed. It doesn't. Silas looked up at her. Do you? She thought about the honest answer, which was that trust, for her, was not a thing she extended in advance. It was a thing she watched for, the way you watched for water in dry country. It either appeared or it didn't, and you didn't pretend it was there before you could see it clearly. Not yet, she said. But I'm watching. Silas nodded. He seemed satisfied with this, with the fairness of it, the absence of pretense. He put his chin back on his knees and went back to watching Rowan Vale move through the evening light, and Evelyn sat beside him on the step, and the prairie settled into the blue-gray of dusk around them, and neither of them said anything more. Ticad. The trouble with Rowan Vale was that he kept being different from what she expected. She had expected, going in, one of several things. She had expected either the obvious kind of rancher who had paid good money and intended to collect on it in ways that would require her to manage a situation carefully and probably eventually leave. Or she had expected the other kind, the decent but distant employer who would work them steadily, not badly, and in whose house they would exist as functional pieces of a working arrangement, nothing more. She had built herself up for either of these and had plans for both. What she had not prepared for was someone who was simply erratic in small ways that didn't add up to a pattern she could name. He fixed the latch on the back room door without being asked 2 days after they arrived. She had mentioned it in passing to May, that the latch stuck and she'd had to force it. And she had not mentioned it to Rowan, and the next morning the latch moved smoothly and there was a smell of fresh oil on it. She did not thank him directly. She wasn't sure she wanted to. He brought back a small tin of hard candies from a supply run to Colby in the 3rd week, and he set the tin on the kitchen table in the morning and said nothing about it and was gone to the paddock by the time anyone found it. Clara opened the tin with great ceremony. Even Silas took one, though he did it when he thought no one was looking. He ate with the household every evening, at the long table in the kitchen, which was apparently how it had always been done on the Vale Ranch. Hands and family, no distinction. He ate quickly and without complaint about whatever was served, which Evelyn found practical if not particularly engaging. He did not dominate the table conversation. In fact, he rarely started any conversation at all. He answered questions. He occasionally made a dry, quiet observation that took a moment to register as humor. Caldas laughed at these with the easy familiarity of a man who had been working for someone long enough to read their tone. Evelyn found herself once, in the 3rd week, almost smiling at something Rowan had said about a horse, and then catching herself and looking down at her plate. She was not going to make that particular mistake. Not again. Not while everything was still this uncertain, this provisional, this far from being anything she could count on. The conversation that changed things, not entirely, but in the way that specific moments shifted the angle of everything, happened on a Thursday evening in the 4th week, after the children were in bed and May had retired and the 2 ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse. Evelyn was still in the kitchen, finishing the last of the cleaning, and Rowan came in from outside and poured himself a cup of the coffee that stayed on the stove most of the day. He sat down at the table, which she hadn't expected. Usually he took his coffee and disappeared. She kept working, her back to him, wiping down the counter. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "The work?" "The whole of it." She wrung out the cloth. "It's hard work. I knew it would be." "That's not an answer to what I asked." She turned around. He was sitting with his cup in both hands, watching her with that direct, unhurried attention that she had still not entirely gotten used to. He looked tired. She hadn't noticed that before, or had not let herself notice. The lines around his eyes that were not just from squinting into sun. "It's better than the alternative," she said. "That's the honest answer." "All right." He drank his coffee. "Why did you really do it?" she said, before she had decided to ask it. He looked at her. "At the auction," she said. "The reason you gave Silas about Dale, that might be true. But there are other boys in Kansas, other situations. You didn't know us. You don't do things without reason, and you didn't do this without a reason beyond needing workers, because a man who needs workers hires workers. He doesn't pay off a widow's debt at an auction." Rowan Vale was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his coffee. "I had a sister," he said, "younger. When our father died, there were debts." He stopped. Evelyn waited. She was 14, he said. There wasn't anybody at the auction who did what I did today. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the prairie did its night sound. Crickets, a distant coyote, the creak of the water pump in the wind. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. She meant it in the plain way, not as a formality. It was a long time ago, he said, which was a way of accepting the condolence without dwelling on it. I've had the land for 12 years. Never had a family situation like yours come up before. When I saw what was about to happen, he paused. I had the money, that's all. That's not all, she said. But I take your meaning. He looked up at her. Something passed across his face that she couldn't fully name. Not quite surprise, more like the expression of a person who had said something they hadn't intended to say and was deciding how to feel about having said it. Your boy, he said. Silas. What about him? He's watching me the way a dog watches a stranger. Hasn't decided yet. He'll decide when he has enough information. That's how he works. How long does that usually take? Depends on the stranger, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile she had seen a few times now. I'll try not to give him a reason to decide against me. That would be wise. He stood up, took his cup to the counter, rinsed it in the basin. Standard end-of-evening efficiency. He went toward the hall door, and she thought that was the end of it, and she went back to folding the dishcloth. Mrs. Mercer. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, and his expression had gone back to its usual settled, non-committal state. But there was something in it she hadn't seen before. Something deliberate, as if he had made a decision about saying something and was carrying it through with the same steady purpose he applied to everything else. You're not a servant here, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know the arrangement looks like one from the outside, but that's not how I run this house. She looked at him for a moment. Then how do you run it? Everyone does their part. Everyone gets treated with respect. What you earn is yours. He paused. You're not here as a favor I'm doing you. I need what you're doing, and your children are earning their keep too, even the little ones just by being here. May hasn't spoken this many words in a year. Evelyn almost smiled. She did not let it reach her face. I'll pass that along. He nodded and went down the hall, and she heard his door close, and she stood in the kitchen alone with the lamp burning low. She stood there for a moment that stretched longer than she meant it to. Then she finished folding the dishcloth, set it over the oven rail, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to Clara breathing beside her and Henry's small sounds on the pallet, and she thought about what he had said, not the way she sometimes turned things over looking for the hidden angle, but with a different kind of attention, the kind that admitted, quietly and to no one, that some things people said were simply what they were. She did not trust him yet, but she was no longer certain she was waiting for a reason not to. The days continued to be hard in the way of honest work rather than the grinding, hopeless difficulty of the weeks before the auction. There was a difference, she found, between hard work that went somewhere and hard work that just kept the water from coming in. Here the work built something. She could see it in the clean kitchen, in Clara's growing comfort, in the way Silas moved around the ranch with less of that braced, waiting tension and more of the focused energy of a boy who had enough to do. She started learning the horses' names. Rowan had 23 animals at current count, and each had a name and a history and a set of particular qualities that he kept in his head with total accuracy, the way some men kept accounts. She overheard him explaining one of them to Cal one afternoon, a gray young mare named Patience, who was smart enough to be suspicious and stubborn about it, and she found herself listening longer than she intended. One morning in the 5th week, she brought water out to the paddock at a moment when Rowan was working with a large bay that Danny had told her was new, brought in from a ranch in Colby, where he'd been badly handled. The horse was tied at the post, but was not still. He kept pulling against the rope, tossing his head, showing the whites of his eyes in the way that meant a constant state of braced alarm. Rowan was standing about 4 feet away, just standing, not touching, not making any sudden movements, just present. Evelyn set the water bucket down and stood at the fence without meaning to stay. Several minutes passed. Rowan didn't move. The horse kept pulling. Then gradually, so gradually that she almost missed the moment it shifted, the horse stopped pulling quite as hard, and his head came down a few inches, and the whites of his eyes were a little less visible. Rowan took one step closer. Not fast. The horse flinched, raised his head, but didn't fully bolt. Rowan stopped. Waited again. "What happened to him?" Evelyn asked, quietly, so as not to startle anything. Rowan didn't look away from the horse. Previous owner used a whip to get him moving. Worked well enough until it didn't, then worked less and less each time. Horse learned fast that people meant pain. Takes a while to undo that. "Can you?" "Usually." He took another step. The horse breathed hard through his nose but held. "Not always. Some of them, you can't convince them it'll be different. They've decided." She watched him take one more step, slowly, and raise his hand at the same deliberate pace until his palm was 6 inches from the horse's neck. The bay trembled, every muscle in him in argument against this, but he didn't pull away. "What's his name?" she asked. "Haven't given him one yet." His hand made contact, just flat against the neck, steady pressure. "I wait until I know them a little." She looked at the horse's eye, large and dark, and still carrying that wary, braced quality, and then at Rowan's hand, steady on the animal's neck. She picked up her bucket and went back to the house. She did not examine, too carefully, what she had just been thinking. The incident with Silas and the fence happened at the end of the 5th week, on a Saturday afternoon when Evelyn was in the kitchen and the sound of raised voices came through the window. She was outside in under a minute. Silas was in the paddock, which he was not supposed to enter without an adult, standing between Pete Doss and the fence line, and Pete had a hand on Silas's arm in the grip of someone who had grabbed first and would think about it later, and Silas was rigid with the particular anger of a boy who had been physically stopped from something and had not yet decided whether to keep trying. "What happened?" Evelyn asked, her voice at its most careful level. "Boy went in after the buckskin spooked and knocked the water bucket into the paddock," Pete said. "I told him I'd get it, but he went in anyway." "I was already closer," Silas said. His jaw was tight. "The buckskin was already worked up from, I know how to move around a horse." "You're 7? What's going on?" Rowan Vale's voice came from behind her. He had come from the direction of the barn, and he took in the scene, Pete's hand on Silas's arm, Silas's expression, the overturned bucket visible inside the paddock, the buckskin still unsettled at the far end. Pete let go of Silas's arm. "Kid went in the paddock without asking." Rowan looked at Silas. "Did you?" "Yes, sir." Silas met his eyes. "The bucket was in there and I was right there. I didn't think it'd take long. The buckskin was worked up." "I knew that. I wasn't going near the buckskin." Rowan looked at him for a long moment, and Evelyn watched her son stand in that look with his spine straight and his hands at his sides, and she thought, not for the first time, about how much of his father was in him and how much was simply his own. "Come here," Rowan said. Silas walked to him, not with the dragging reluctance of a child expecting punishment, but with the upright wariness of someone walking into a conversation they weren't sure of. Rowan crouched down to be level with him, which Evelyn noted. "What do you know about working around a spooked horse?" Rowan asked. Silas blinked. This was apparently not what he'd expected. "You move slow. You don't make noise. You don't go between them and a fence if you can help it." "Where'd you learn that?" "My father. Before he got sick." Something crossed Rowan's face quickly, then was gone. "All right. That's good information to have. The rule about the paddock isn't about whether you know horses. It's about whether I know what you know. I don't know you well enough yet to know what you know." He paused. "So until I do, you ask. Not because you're not capable, because I need to know who's in there before something goes wrong. Understood?" Silas looked at him. The burning, measuring look. Then, with visible effort, something in him shifted. Not softened exactly, but adjusted, the way someone adjusts to a truth they were going to reach anyway. "Yes, sir," he said. Rowan stood up. "Good. Now go get the bucket. Walk slow on the left side and don't look at the buckskin directly." Silas went into the paddock without any further discussion, retrieved the bucket in under a minute with careful, unhurried movements, and came back out. The buckskin watched him with ears swiveled but did not move. Pete Doss was looking at the boy with the expression of someone recalculating. Silas handed the bucket to Rowan Vale. Rowan took it. "Good," he said, which was all he said, and went back to the barn. Evelyn watched her son watch him go. Silas's expression was unreadable in the way it sometimes was when he was revising something in his head. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. And as he passed Evelyn, he said low and without breaking stride, "He's fair." She looked after him, just 2 words. Coming from Silas, they were as significant as a formal declaration from anyone else. She stood in the afternoon sun by the paddock fence and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but the first distant shape of something that might, in time, become it. The ranch was difficult, and the work was relentless, and she did not trust the future in any direction. And she was still carrying Thomas's absence like a stone in her chest that hadn't gone anywhere. But there was food, and there was work that meant something, and her children were safe in the same place as her. It wasn't enough to be called good, but it was more than she'd had on that auction block, standing in the August sun while the town of Harlan Creek watched her family be taken apart. Some days, more than enough had to be enough. She went back inside. The 7th week brought the first real cold snap of the season, arriving without warning the way Kansas weather always did. One morning, simply different from the morning before. The sky a hard, flat gray, and the wind out of the northwest carrying a bite that hadn't been in it the day prior. Evelyn had woken before dawn, as she always did, and had gone out to the porch in the half-dark to bring in the firewood she'd stacked the previous afternoon, and the cold had hit her face like a wet cloth. Summer was done. That was the plain fact of it. And with the cold came the particular mathematics of a working ranch shifting into its autumn accounting. What had been built, what had been earned, what needed to be done before the hard months arrived, and made everything harder. She had been on the Vale Ranch for just under 2 months. In 2 months, she had learned the names of all 23 horses. She had learned that May Sutton drank her coffee so strong it was essentially a moral statement, and that she hummed to herself when she was in a good mood and went completely silent when she wasn't, and that the silence was worse. She had learned that Cal Doss was funny in a dry, sideways way that never announced itself, and that Pete was the better worker of the 2 brothers, but Cal was the better man in a crisis. She had learned that Danny, the quiet 14-year-old, was quietly extraordinary with horses in a way that Rowan had clearly noticed and was deliberately cultivating, and that Danny knew this and was working twice as hard because of it. She had learned things about Rowan Vale too, though she collected these more carefully, the way you handle something you're not yet sure is fragile. He woke earlier than anyone else on the ranch and was usually already outside by the time she had the stove going. He kept his own accounts in a battered ledger that he worked on most evenings, and he was precise about money in the way of someone who had been without it long enough to understand what it meant. He was patient with the horses in a way that was clearly not performance. He was genuinely patient, in a deep, structural way, as if he had decided early on that most problems yielded to time and attention, and that losing your temper was mostly just wasted energy. She had seen him frustrated exactly once, when a delivery from Colby arrived short by half, and the driver had the manner of someone who thought a ranch 40 miles from town would just accept what they were given. Rowan had been very quiet on the subject. It was a particular kind of quiet that had made the driver recalculate. The full order arrived 2 days later. She had also learned that he noticed more than he said, which was either a quality she respected or one she found unsettling, depending on the day. The cold snap brought the work inward. There was fence repair that had been deferred through the heat, and supply inventory, and the particular task of winterizing a barn. Checking boards, caulking gaps, making sure the animals would be insulated when the temperature truly dropped. Evelyn added heavier cooking to her days, the kind that required the stove burning longer. Stews and baked things that filled the kitchen with warmth and smell, and that the men ate with the silent gratitude of people working in cold air. Silas was thriving. She watched him and felt the particular complicated thing a mother feels when she sees her child becoming more than she could have made him on her own. He had been working beside Danny for 2 months now, and Danny had taught him things. Rope work, basic tack maintenance, the specific vocabulary of horse handling that Rowan used, and that Silas had absorbed with the same focused hunger he brought to everything he decided was worth knowing. He was still 7. He still had the gap in his front teeth and the tendency to go serious in the middle of a laugh when something occurred to him, and at night he still slept with the flatness of a child who had worn himself completely out. But during the day, on the ranch, he moved with a confidence that had not been there in Harlan Creek, and Evelyn sometimes watched him from the kitchen window and thought about Thomas, about whether Thomas would have recognized this boy or needed a moment. She thought Thomas would have needed a moment, and then would have been proud enough to embarrass everyone. Clara had appointed herself May's assistant with the full authority of a 5-year-old who has decided something and considered the matter closed. May, who had lived alone in her own competence for so long that other people's presence was mostly an inconvenience, had accepted this arrangement with the grudging tolerance of someone who has lost an argument they hadn't known they were having. She taught Clara to braid bread dough and to identify which herbs were which by smell and to wipe down the kitchen table in the correct direction for a clean finish. And Clara executed each lesson with a gravity that made May's expression do something complicated. "That child," May said to Evelyn one evening, "is going to either run something or ruin something, possibly both." "She comes by it honestly," Evelyn said. May looked at her over her coffee. "Yes," she said, with a flatness that might have been a compliment. Henry had started walking properly in the 7th week, which transformed his experience of the world from horizontal to vertical, and filled him with an ambition that his legs were not entirely equal to yet. He fell down a great deal. He got up a great deal. He had discovered the barn with the wonder of someone who had found a new continent, and the horses, the gentle ones, the ones whose training was advanced enough that a toddling child was merely interesting rather than alarming, tolerated his attention with the resignation of animals that had seen most things. It was Rowan who had first taken Henry into the barn. He had not asked Evelyn's permission, which had briefly annoyed her, and then she had come to the barn door and seen Rowan crouched beside Henry at the stall of the old gray mare, holding Henry's hand flat and guiding it to the horse's nose. And Henry's face had been so purely astonished, that absolute, uncomplicated delight of a child encountering something large and warm and gentle, that the annoyance had complicated itself before she could hold on to it cleanly. She had said nothing. She had watched for a moment and then gone back to the kitchen. That night, Rowan had said at supper, to no one in particular, "Henry's not afraid of them," as if this were a piece of information the table needed. May had said, "Children his age aren't afraid of anything yet. That's why they need watching." "Still," Rowan had said, and gone back to his food. Evelyn had looked at her plate. The storm began on a Tuesday in the 9th week, and it built so fast that by the time anyone on the ranch understood what was coming, it was already closer than comfortable. The morning had been overcast, a low gray ceiling pressing down on the grassland, and the wind had been picking up since before breakfast. Cal had said at the table that the sky looked wrong, which was a rancher's way of saying something specific without having the meteorological vocabulary to be precise about it. Rowan had looked out the window for a long moment before sitting down, and he had eaten faster than usual, which Evelyn had noted. By noon, the wind was serious. By 2 in the afternoon, it was a different thing entirely. A sustained roar that pressed against the house walls and found every gap in the boards and sent a cold draft through the kitchen, no matter how much wood was in the stove. The horses in the pasture had already been moved to the barn by Cal and Pete, which was the right call. The sky to the northwest was the color of a bruise, dark purple-gray, a mass of cloud that moved with the purposeful speed of weather that has decided what it's going to do. Rowan was outside. He had been outside for most of the afternoon, moving between the outbuildings, doing the rapid, methodical work of someone securing a property before a storm hit it. She could see him through the kitchen window in intervals, checking the barn doors, moving something from the smaller outbuilding that could become a projectile, assessing the fence line along the north pasture with the calculating look of someone deciding what could be saved and what would just have to take its chances. "Stay inside," he had said to her in passing, when she had come to the door to ask if he needed help. I know you can. I'm saying stay inside. The children need someone to stay." He had not stopped moving when he said it. She had watched him go and had wanted to argue and had not, because he was right about the children. The storm broke at 4 in the afternoon with a violence that was almost personal. Rain and wind together, and hail that came in sideways and hit the windows like thrown gravel, and the sound of it was so loud that Evelyn had to put her mouth close to May's ear to be heard. She had gathered the children in the back room, Clara pressed against her side, Henry in her lap with his fists in her shirt, Silas sitting against the wall with his arms folded and his eyes on the window, with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm. She read to them from the only book she'd brought in the small box from Harlan Creek, raising her voice against the noise, and she kept her voice steady even when the wind hit a pitch that made the walls flex and Henry buried his face in her shoulder. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it was over cleanly. The weather moving east the way storms did on the plains, leaving behind a silence that felt stunned, and a sky that was washed pale and cold, and everything on the ground rearranged from where it had been. Rowan came inside just after 7. He was soaked through, mud to the knee, a cut on his forehead from something she couldn't ask about yet because she could see he was still accounting. He went straight through the kitchen without stopping, out to the porch, looked east and north, came back in. "Barn solid," he said. "Lost part of the south fence. The small outbuilding lost a section of roof." "Anyone hurt?" Evelyn asked. "Cal's got a bruised shoulder. Nothing serious." He pulled off his wet coat. He looked at her with that direct, assessing look. "All of you?" "Fine." She paused. "Henry's shaken. He'll settle." He nodded. He went to warm himself by the stove, and May put coffee in front of him without being asked, and he held the cup in both hands, and she could see the cold in him by how long it took the tension to leave his shoulders. The damage was not catastrophic. It was substantial and required 2 weeks of repair work that stretched every able person on the ranch. But none of it was the kind of loss that broke a place. Fences could be restrung. A roof section could be replaced. The horses were safe. The house was standing. Evelyn worked the repair weeks the same as everyone else. Not the heavy structural work, but everything adjacent to it. Meals carried out to where the men were working so they didn't lose daylight to coming in, materials organized and transported, and the fence wire itself, which was work she could do and did without being asked. She had strong hands. 9 years of frontier life had seen to that. Silas worked beside Danny and Pete on the fence line with a concentration that made Pete say, at the end of the second day, "Kid's got more endurance than most grown men I've worked with." He said it to Cal, but loudly enough that it was meant to be heard, and Evelyn had seen Silas's ears go slightly red, though his expression didn't change. It was in the 3rd week after the storm that the second disaster arrived, and this one was faster and did not announce itself at all. The prairie fire started somewhere to the east, in the dry grassland past Holt's property, and by the time any of them saw the smoke, it was already mid-afternoon and the wind was out of the east, which was the worst possible direction. The smoke appeared as a dark smear on the horizon that Rowan, who had been outside, saw first. He was at the kitchen door before Evelyn had processed what the smell was. "Fire coming from the east," he said. His voice was level, which was itself alarming because level meant serious. "Wind's pushing it toward us. We've got maybe 2 hours." She looked at him. "I need you to take the children north to the creek bed and stay there until I come for you or send Cal," he said. "Take May. Take what you can carry of the important things. And the horses? We'll start moving them. You can't move 40 horses with 3 men in 2 hours." "I know that." He looked at her. "Go north." She held his eyes for a beat. "Give me 10 minutes with the horses first. I can move the near paddock animals to the north pasture. That's 12 horses closer to the creek. 12 fewer you have to move from the barn under panic." He stared at her. The calculation was visible on his face. What she was worth against what she could do against the time available. 10 minutes, he said. Then north. She had the 12 horses from the near paddock moving toward the north pasture in 8 minutes. She knew them well enough by then to know which responded to pressure and which needed space and which would follow if you just walked the first one in the right direction. She pushed through the gate, got the lead mare, a calm, heavy-shouldered animal called Grace that the others deferred to, moving north, and the others followed with the instinctive herd logic that made horses both the most difficult and most manageable of animals. 8 minutes. She closed the north pasture gate and ran back to the house. May had the children ready. Clara was holding Henry by the hand with the focused seriousness of someone who had been given a job and intended to do it. Silas had a bundle under his arm. He had, on his own initiative, grabbed the small box from the back room, the one Evelyn had brought from Harlan Creek, the one with Thomas's letters in it. She looked at him and felt something rise in her chest so fast she had to look away. "Good," she said. "Let's go." She took Henry. May moved faster than Evelyn would have credited, her small, sharp figure covering ground with the efficiency of someone who had survived things before this. Silas kept pace without being told. Clara trotted on her short legs with enormous determination. They made the creek bed in 15 minutes and sat behind the low embankment in the smell of damp clay while the smoke thickened to the east and the light went orange and strange. From the creek bed, she could see the ranch buildings, low and gray in the distance, and she could see movement near the barn, small figures moving animals, and a truck she recognized as Pete's horse, and the smear of smoke getting closer in a front that was wider than she had understood it would be when Rowan had said it was coming. She did not pray. She watched. The fire came across the open grassland with a speed that was almost beautiful in the terrible way of powerful natural things. A racing orange line following the wind, the grass in front of it still standing, and the grass behind it already black and smoking, and the line moved toward the ranch with the certainty of something that could not be negotiated with. What stopped it, or rather what turned it, was the fire break. She hadn't seen it before, hadn't known it was there, but she could see it now. A strip of plowed earth on the south and east sides of the ranch property, perhaps 30 feet wide, bare dirt that the fire couldn't cross because there was nothing to carry it. It had been cut earlier in the season, she realized. Rowan had prepared for this. The fire reached the plowed strip and spread along it looking for a crossing, and the wind pushed it north of the property instead of through it, and the buildings stood. There was a moment, a specific moment she would remember afterward, where the fire front passed north of the barn, and the orange light was on everything, on the gray wood of the buildings, and the dirt of the yard, and the faces of the men who were still out there. And it looked, from the creek bed, like the world was ending. And then the fire moved past, and the world was still there. She let out a breath she had been holding for most of an hour, but it was not over, not entirely. She was still at the creek bed, Henry asleep in her arms from exhaustion and the strange sedative effect of crisis on very small children, when Danny came running from the direction of the ranch with a look on his face that she recognized from the deepest part of her instincts. The look of someone who needs help and is running toward whoever might have it. "It's Cal," he said when he reached her, gasping, bent at the knees for a moment before he straightened. "He got turned around in the smoke when we were moving the last horses, and a spark caught his sleeve. His arm—" He stopped. "It's bad." She was already moving. May caught her arm. "The children—" "Stay with them," Evelyn said. She looked at Silas. "Watch Henry. Don't leave the creek bed until May says." Silas looked at her with that burning, serious attention. "Be careful," he said, and it came out like something he hadn't planned to say. She ran. Cal Doss was in the barn, sitting on the ground against one of the stalls, and the burn on his left arm ran from the elbow nearly to the wrist in a way that made Evelyn's stomach turn over when she saw it. Pete was beside him looking helpless, which men often did when the problem was flesh rather than machinery or weather. Rowan was on his knees next to Cal with a bucket of water and was doing the right thing, keeping it wet. But the burn was deep enough and wide enough that it needed more than cold water. Cal's face was white under the smoke grime and his teeth were set and he was not making much sound, which was sometimes a good sign and sometimes a very bad one. "I need the medical box," Evelyn said. "Where is it?" "House. Shelf above the washstand in the back hall." She ran to the house, found it, and was back in the barn in under 3 minutes. She had learned basic wound care from the same frontier necessity that had taught her everything else, and she had dressed burns before. Not this severe, but enough to know the principles. She knelt beside Cal and assessed it without speaking, and what she saw was that the skin in the central section of the burn was damaged badly enough that it needed clean dressing, kept clean, and that Cal needed to not use that arm for a long time. "This is going to hurt," she told him. "It already hurts," he said through his teeth. "It's going to hurt more," she said. "I'm sorry." She worked steadily, cleaning and dressing, and Cal was very still for someone in that level of pain. He gripped Pete's arm with his right hand, and Pete let him and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. Rowan watched her work with an expression she couldn't look at right then, because she was focused on Cal's arm, and she needed to stay focused. When she had the wound properly dressed and bandaged, she sat back on her heels and looked at Cal. "You need a doctor," she said. "A real one, not me. This needs to be looked at properly in Colby as soon as you can get there." "Tomorrow?" Cal said. "Tonight would be better. This doesn't get infected tonight. Tomorrow is fine. But tonight would be better." Rowan stood up. "Pete'll take you." It wasn't a question. Pete nodded. He was already looking at his brother with the expression of someone who has just understood how close something came. Cal looked at Evelyn. His face was still white, but there was something in it now that had not been there when she arrived. "Ma'am," he said, and it was the most he could manage, but she understood what it meant. "Keep it clean," she told him. "Keep it up. Don't let anyone touch it without washing their hands first." She paused. "You're going to be all right." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because what Cal needed right now was not her uncertainty. She was fairly certain. She was not absolutely certain. She said it as if she were. Pete helped Cal to his feet, and they went out to get a wagon hitched, and Danny went after them to help, and then it was just Evelyn and Rowan in the barn, the horses in their stalls breathing in the smoky air, the orange light gone now and replaced by the ordinary dark of a Kansas evening with a new smell in it. She was still kneeling on the ground. She hadn't gotten up yet, which was partly because her legs had the unsteady feeling of adrenaline finishing its work, and partly because she needed a moment. Rowan crouched down beside her, not next to her exactly, a foot away, in the way he had of being present without crowding. "You got 12 horses to the north pasture in 8 minutes, he said. "I knew which ones to move first," she said. "You ran back and dressed a burn in the field." He paused. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "I didn't have a choice about learning." She looked at her hands. There was blood on her right palm, a small cut she hadn't noticed, probably from the barn floor when she'd knelt. She looked at it without much emotion. "Thomas got burned his second year of farming. Fuel can went wrong. I had to manage until we could get him to town." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "The fire break," she said. "You'd already cut it." "Cut it every September." "You didn't tell anyone it was there." "It's in the south field. Anyone who looked would have seen it." He paused. "You were watching from the creek bed." "I was watching from the creek bed," she confirmed. The barn was quiet for a moment. One of the horses shifted in its stall, a soft rhythmic sound of hoof on straw. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both knew it. She looked at him. The dim light of the barn, smoke still faint in the air, his face that had been outside for most of its life, with the lines and the steadiness and the tiredness of a long, hard day on it. "Thank you," he said. And then, because he was not a man who dressed things up, "I'm not just talking about tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. She was tired in a way that went past her body, a bone-deep tiredness that had been building since August and that tonight had drawn against its last reserves. She was not in a state for careful guard. She was not in a state for the measured, watchful distance she had maintained for 9 weeks. What she said was, "You're not going to thank me for doing my part." "I'm not thanking you for your part," he said. "I'm thanking you for being—" He paused. He was looking for the right word and not finding it quickly, which she had learned was unusual for him. "More than I expected," he said finally. "More than anyone here expected. That matters." She looked at him. She was aware, in the way that you become aware of something you have been not looking at for a long time, that the distance she had been maintaining was not entirely about distrust anymore. It was about something else. Something she had put in the locked room at the back of herself alongside the grief and the exhaustion and the things she hadn't let herself feel since Thomas died. She stood up, her legs held. "I'm going to get the children," she said. He stood up too. He did not say anything else. But he walked with her out of the barn and across the yard in the dark, and neither of them spoke on the way, and the silence between them had changed its quality in a way that she could feel but was not yet prepared to name. May met them at the edge of the property, coming from the north with Silas beside her, and Clara asleep on her shoulder, and Henry awake and looking at the sky with enormous dark eyes. Silas looked from Evelyn to Rowan and back with that measuring, filing away attention. Evelyn took Henry from May. Henry gripped her collar and made a small sound of satisfaction. "Cal?" May asked. "Pete's taking him to town tonight. He'll be all right." May made the small sound that meant she was filing the information. Then she looked at the smoke still drifting in the eastern sky, and at the house standing in the dark, and at Rowan Vale beside Evelyn, and she said nothing further, which was its own kind of statement. They walked back to the house in the dark, all of them together. Smoke in the air and cold ground underfoot, and the smell of burnt grass from the east that would be there for days. Evelyn carried Henry and felt the solid, warm weight of him, and Silas walked beside her, and Clara was still sleeping on May's bony shoulder, and she thought about Thomas, not with the sharp, cutting grief of the early weeks, but with something more settled, more like a long conversation she was still in the middle of. You would have liked it here, she thought. The horses especially. You would have taken to the horses. She did not say this out loud. It was not for saying out loud. She walked through the front door of the house with her children around her and the smell of her own kitchen coming out to meet her, and she thought that she did not know what was coming next, or what shape the future would take, or what she was building toward, and that for tonight, in this specific hour, after fire and blood and a long, hard, frightening day, that uncertainty was something she could live with. It was not comfort. It was not resolution. But it was real, and it was hers. And she had learned this fall that real things, however hard, however unresolved, were the only things worth keeping. Cal came back from Colby on the third day with his arm properly dressed by a doctor and a bottle of something the doctor had prescribed and a look on his face of a man who has been frightened and has decided not to show it. He returned to light work within a week, though Evelyn watched him favor the arm with the automatic protectiveness of someone who had not yet fully trusted that it was healing. She checked the dressing every other day without making ceremony of it. And Cal let her without making ceremony of it either, and that was how they handled it. The fire had changed something on the ranch. Not dramatically, not in any way anyone announced, but the particular way the household moved around itself had shifted, a degree or two in some direction she couldn't precisely name, the way a room feels different after furniture has been rearranged even before you identify what moved. The men were easier with her. Pete, who had been respectful but distant in the cautious way of someone reserving judgment, now spoke to her with the directness of someone who had decided a verdict. Danny had started asking her questions. Small, practical questions about the horse's feed, about the supply schedule, the kind he would have taken to Rowan before, as if her authority in the household had quietly expanded beyond the kitchen. May noticed? May noticed everything she had learned and said approximately 1/3 of what she noticed, and that was more than enough. "You've settled in," May said one morning, without preamble, standing at the counter with her hands in bread dough. Evelyn looked up from the supply list she was writing. "I suppose I have." "The ranch suits you." She considered whether this was a question or a statement, and decided it was a statement that was waiting to see what she did with it. "It's hard work," she said. "Most things worth doing are," May said, and went back to her dough, and the subject was apparently closed, but it wasn't really. What Evelyn did not say to May, or to anyone, was that the ranch had done something to her that she had not anticipated. She had expected to survive here. She had expected to work and keep her children together and eventually find some stable ground beneath her feet. She had not expected to find herself on a cold October morning, looking out at the north pasture where 12 horses stood in the flat gray light and thinking that this was, in some quiet and unglamorous way, home. Not because it was beautiful, though it had its moments. Because she knew it, because she had earned her place in it through the plain currency of work and difficulty, and that was the only kind of belonging she had ever fully trusted. The problem, the thing she had been managing with increasing effort for the past 3 weeks, was Rowan Vale. Not any specific thing he had done. He had not pressed her, had not made declarations, had said nothing since the barn after the fire that required her to respond to it directly. He was, if anything, more careful in how he moved around her than he had been before, which was its own kind of statement. He gave her more space. He asked her opinion on household things in a way that was genuine, not performative consultation, but actual questions where he waited for the actual answer. He had started directing small questions about the horses to her too, which she suspected was deliberate. He was, she had come to understand, a man who showed what he felt through what he did rather than what he said, and once she understood the language, the things he was saying were not easy to ignore. She was 43 days past the fire when she finally admitted to herself, in the privacy of the pre-dawn kitchen with the stove going and no one else awake, that she had fallen into something she had not been trying to fall into. She stood with her coffee and looked at the window where the dark showed her own faint reflection, and she said it plainly to herself, in the internal voice she reserved for things too serious for softening. She had feelings for Rowan Vale. Not gratitude, though that was there too, and she was honest enough not to confuse the two. Not dependence, though he had become central to the landscape of her days. Something older and more inconvenient than either of those things. And it terrified her. Not because he was a bad man. The evidence was conclusive by now that he was not a bad man. It terrified her because Thomas had been a good man too, and Thomas had been gone for 4 months, and she did not know what it meant about her grief, about her loyalty, about the woman she understood herself to be. That she could stand in another man's kitchen and feel what she was feeling while her husband's letters were still in a box in the back room. She put down the coffee. She went out to do the morning work, and she did not examine it again for several days, the way you leave a bruise alone because pressing on it doesn't make it heal faster. Silas found out before she told him. She hadn't told anyone, but Silas had always been able to read her the way certain children can read their mothers. Not the words, but the frequency underneath the words, the specific texture of her silences. He had been watching her, and watching Rowan with that tireless measuring attention for weeks, and he arrived at his conclusions the way he always did, on his own schedule, in private, and then he confronted them directly. It was a Sunday evening in late October after supper, when the house had gone quiet and Rowan was out at the barn doing the final check, and Evelyn was on the porch in her coat, just standing in the cold air, because sometimes she needed the cold air to think clearly. Silas came out and sat on the porch step and looked at the dark barn where the lamp was moving behind the boards. He didn't lead up to it. He was, in this as in everything, his father's son. "You like him," he said. It was not a question. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She had several options available to her. She could redirect. She could tell him he was too young to understand. She could change the subject. She chose none of these because Silas was 7 years old and sharper than most adults she knew, and he deserved better than to be managed. "I don't know what I feel," she said. "I'm still working that out." He was quiet for a long moment. In the barn, the lamp moved, paused, moved again. "Did you stop liking Papa?" he asked. The question hit her in the chest the way she should have expected it to, because of course that was the question. Of course it was. It was the only question that mattered to a 7-year-old boy who had lost his father 4 months ago. "No," she said. She sat down beside him on the step. "That's not how it works. You don't stop." "Then how does it work?" She tried to find the right words for something she was still working out herself. "Your father is—" She stopped, started again. "The place your father has in here." She put her hand to her chest without drama, just indicating, "That doesn't go away. It doesn't get replaced. It's his. It'll always be his. What I might feel for someone else, if I do, that would be somewhere else. A different place. Not instead of. Not less." Silas looked at her hand on her chest. He thought about this with the visible, serious consideration he gave to things that mattered. "That's confusing," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Is it fair to Papa?" She sat with this question for a long moment, because it deserved a long moment. The cold came up off the porch boards. The lamp in the barn stopped moving. "I think your Papa," she said slowly, "would have wanted us to be safe and fed and to have a place. I think if he'd known what we were going to face, he would have wanted someone to be looking out for us." She paused. "I don't know if it's fair or not. I'm not sure fair is the right word for it. I think it's—" She tried to find it. "Human," she said. "I think it's just human." Silas looked at the barn for a long time. "He's different from Papa," he said finally. "Very different." Papa was louder. He laughed more. "He did. Mr. Vale is—" He searched. "He pays attention different, like he's looking for the thing that matters and not saying anything until he finds it." Evelyn looked at her son in the dim light and felt something move through her. Love for him so specific and so acute, it was almost painful. "That's exactly right," she said. Silas pulled his coat tighter. "I don't want another Papa," he said, and it came out with a clarity that told her he had been carrying it for a while and was relieved to put it down. "I'm not asking you to have one," she said. "If you—" He stopped, tried again. "If something happened, with him, it wouldn't mean I have to—" "No," she said. "It wouldn't mean anything except what you chose it to mean. That's yours. Nobody can tell you what that is." He looked at her, his jaw, Thomas's jaw, his eyes, entirely his own. "Okay," he said. It was not an endorsement. It was not a prohibition. It was a 7-year-old boy doing the hard work of holding two true things at the same time and managing it with more grace than most adults she knew. She put her arm around him and he leaned against her in the unself-conscious way he rarely allowed anymore. That specific childhood closeness he was already starting to reserve for private moments, and they sat on the step in the cold until the barn lamp went out. Rowan said something to her that same week, though he had not known about the conversation with Silas and she had not told him. They were both in the kitchen after supper on a Wednesday, a situation that had become, without either of them deciding it, a regular occurrence. The household going to bed, Rowan finishing his coffee, Evelyn finishing whatever task she'd left for last. The two of them in the warm kitchen with the stove burning low. He had been watching her for a few minutes while she reorganized the supply shelf, and she had been aware of being watched in the specific way she was always aware of him, not uncomfortable, which was itself something she had noted. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because that's the only way I know how to say things." She turned around. He was sitting at the table with his hands around his cup, and his expression was the settled, careful look of someone who has been preparing something and is now doing it whether or not it goes well. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's been building between us," he said. "I don't think you'd respect that, and I don't have any interest in pretending. But I also don't want to push something on you that you haven't had time to find your own way to." He paused. "I've been thinking about this for a while." She leaned against the counter. "So have I," she said, which was more than she had intended to say, but which was true. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. He was not easily surprised, but something that had the quality of relief, careful and quiet. "I'm not trying to replace anything," he said. "I know your husband was real, and what you had was real, and that doesn't disappear. I'm not asking it to." "No," she said. "You're not." "What I am—" He stopped. He was not a man of elaborate words, and he was working at the edges of his vocabulary. She could see it. "I'm asking if there's room," he said finally. "Not for a replacement, just room." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was steady. Outside, the wind moved in the prairie grass with the low sound it made on cold nights. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the box in the back room and the letters in it and the man who had written them. The man who had loved her in the solid, reliable way that had been, for 9 years, the ground she stood on. She felt the loss of him, real and specific, and not going anywhere. And she thought about the last 11 weeks. The fence repair and the fire and Cal's arm and the morning kitchen conversations and the barn after the storm and a man on a gray horse at an auction block who had not looked at her the way Corbin Dale had looked at her, and the 12 horses she had moved in 8 minutes, and Silas on the porch step saying he pays attention different. "I'm afraid," she said. It was the truest thing she had said to him, and she said it without flinching because she was done managing the distance between them. "I know," he said. "Not of you specifically. I know that too. Of doing this again, letting someone be central, and then—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He looked at her with that steady, patient attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. "I can't promise you nothing bad happens," he said. "I can't promise anything about the future except what I intend. And what I intend is, I want to do right by you and your children for as long as I'm able." He paused. "I can't promise more than that, but I can promise that." It was not a sweeping declaration. It was not a man trying to dazzle her. It was a working rancher at his kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night, making a straightforward promise that had the particular weight of something he intended to keep. She thought briefly about the women she had known who had made choices like this from desperation, from having no other option, from the fear of something worse. She thought about how different it felt to be making it with options, with wages, with the knowledge that she could stay or go and both were hers to decide. "All right," she said, "there's room." He held her eyes for a moment, and the thing she saw in them was not triumph. It was something quieter and more serious than that. A man understanding what he had been given and treating it accordingly. "I won't waste it," he said. She believed him. She was not certain she would not be afraid again tomorrow, or that the locked room at the back of herself would not present difficulties she couldn't anticipate. She was not building towards certainty. She was building towards something more modest and more honest, the kind of trust that got made day by day, through the plain acts of showing up and doing right, and being who you said you were. She turned back to the supply shelf because the work was still there, and he drank the last of his coffee, and the stove burned low, and outside the prairie was cold and wide and indifferent, and inside the kitchen was warm. The weeks that followed were not dramatically different from the weeks before, which was both the surprise and the point. They did not suddenly behave like people in a story. There was no change that announced itself or required the household to adjust. Rowan did not cease being who he was. Evelyn did not cease being who she was. What changed was smaller and more real, the way they talked in the evenings, the particular quality of being in the same room. There was less management, less of the careful positioning she had maintained for months. She found herself saying things to him, ordinary things, thoughts she would not have aired before, and it was the ease of it that told her something important had moved. He helped Henry learn to walk along the porch rail one afternoon, crouching beside him with a patience that Henry seemed to understand was different from other adults' patience, that it would not expire, would not redirect, would stay right there for as long as it took. Henry took 4 steps and fell into Rowan's hands and laughed the high, uncomplicated laugh of a baby who had accomplished something, and Rowan caught him and set him upright and said, "Again?" and Henry went again. Evelyn watched from the doorway and did not move. Clara had reached the point of informing Rowan, without any prompting from anyone, about the contents of her apron pockets on a daily basis, which was her highest form of trust. He received each item, a piece of pale green glass, a small feather, a smooth red stone, with an attention that she clearly found appropriate. He asked questions. What made the glass interesting? Where she had found the stone. Clara answered with the comprehensive seriousness of a dedicated curator, and Rowan listened with the kind of focus that is either genuine or the most sophisticated performance of sincerity ever witnessed, and Evelyn had concluded some time ago that it was genuine. Silas was harder, not hostile, not after their conversation on the porch, which seemed to have worked something loose in him, but careful in his own way, watchful in his own way, making his own independent assessment on his own timeline without reference to what anyone else concluded. This was who he was, and she would not have changed it. The thing that moved Silas came from Rowan directly, and Rowan had not planned it. It was a gray November morning, and Silas had been in the paddock with Danny working on halter training for a young horse that was still uncertain about the whole situation. The horse had spooked at something, a bird, a sound, nothing visible, and had reared and come down badly, and in the scramble Silas had gone down hard in the mud, and the horse had stepped close enough to be dangerous, though he hadn't been hurt. By the time Rowan got to him, Silas was standing up, muddy and shaken, and working very hard to not show the shaken part. Danny was talking to the horse, getting him settled. Silas had his hands at his sides, and his jaw was set in the way that meant he was holding something back. Rowan looked him over. "You're all right?" "Yes, sir." "Horse didn't get you?" "No, sir." Rowan crouched down to his level, the way he'd done with the paddock incident months ago. Silas looked at him with the flat, forced steadiness of a boy who did not want to be seen to be scared. "That was scary," Rowan said. Not as a question. Not as sympathy, exactly. Just as a plain acknowledgement of a fact. Something cracked in Silas's face. Very briefly. Then he reassembled it. "I'm fine." "You can be fine and it can still have been scary," Rowan said. "Those aren't different things." Silas looked at him for a long moment. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was holding something in. "Papa used to say being scared was just your body paying attention," he said. Came out quieter than his normal voice. Rowan held his eyes. "Your papa was right about that." Silas looked down at his muddy boots. He took one breath that was steadier than the ones before it. "I didn't let go of the lead rope," he said, "even when I went down. Danny said that was the right thing." "That was exactly the right thing," Rowan said. "A lot of grown men would have let it go." Silas looked up. He was trying to read Rowan's face, and Rowan let him. Did not give him the performance of a compliment, but just the plain, steady fact of meaning it. "Can I keep working with him?" Silas asked. "The young horse. When he's settled for the day, yes." Silas nodded. He looked at the horse, who had come back to something like calm under Danny's hands, and there was something in his face that was simultaneously 7 years old and much older than that. "Mr. Vale," he said. "Yeah." "You don't try to act like my papa." He said it straight, without accusation, as if he was reporting something he had observed. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't." "That's—" Silas stopped. He was searching for what he meant, which was unusual for him. That's better, he said finally. Trying to would be. He made a small gesture that encompassed the inadequacy of the attempt he was describing. I know, Rowan said. Silas picked up the lead rope he had dropped in the fall. He handed it to Danny, and they went back to work. And Rowan stood up. And when he turned back toward the barn, he found Evelyn standing at the fence line, because she had heard the commotion and had come, and had stayed without either of them knowing. He walked to where she was standing. He stopped on the other side of the fence. She was looking at her son, who was back at work with the young horse like nothing had happened, except that it had. He's extraordinary, Rowan said. He is, she agreed. They stood at the fence for a moment. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. His expression was open in a way she did not see often. The careful composure lay down for a moment. I know what this is and isn't, he said. I know there's a long way still to go, and there are things I can't fix and things nobody can fix. But I want you to know I understand what you brought to this ranch. All four of you, not as workers, as... He stopped. I'm not good at these words. You're doing all right, she said. I don't want you to leave, he said. Not when the debt's worked off. Not ever, if you're willing. He paused. And I'm not saying that as the man who paid the debt. I'm saying it as... He stopped again. I know who you're saying it as, she said. The wind moved through the fence wire with its low note. The young horse in the paddock had dropped his head and was letting Silas lead him in a slow circle. 2 feet of trust built one careful step at a time. She looked at Rowan Vale, this man she had not known 4 months ago. This man who was so deeply different from the man she had spent 9 years with, and who was, in his own plain and unglamorous way, someone she had come to rely on in the deep sense of the word. The sense that had nothing to do with debt, and everything to do with the quiet daily evidence of who a person was. I know, she said again. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was 2 people standing at a fence in November, both of them imperfect, and both of them carrying things that didn't dissolve just because something new had arrived, and understanding each other across the width of a fence rail with the plain, unvarnished clarity that honest people occasionally managed. It was enough for now. For now, it was exactly enough. She straightened. She turned back toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, not reaching for her hand, not making a production of it, just walking in the same direction, which was itself a thing she had come to understand as his particular language. They walked across the November yard, and the horses moved in the paddock, and inside the house May's lamp was lit in the window, a steady gold square in the gray afternoon, the kind of light that means the stove is going and supper will be on and the people inside are warm. December came to the Vale Ranch the way it came to all of Kansas, without apology and with an intention to stay a while. The first hard frost arrived on the second morning of the month, and Evelyn woke before dawn to find the window glass printed with ice crystals, the kind that formed elaborate purposeless patterns that Clara would study for 10 minutes with the solemnity of a scholar before the warmth of the room dissolved them. The ground outside had gone iron hard overnight. The horse's breath showed in the paddock. The work didn't stop for any of it. It never stopped. But it shifted in character, became more about preserving and maintaining than building, the winter mode of a working ranch that knew better than to be caught unprepared. She had been on the Vale Ranch for nearly 4 months. She knew this place now the way you know a place that has cost you something to learn. Not just the layout of it, the distances between buildings, the specific creak of the third porch step, the way the kitchen light hit the far wall in the morning. She knew its rhythms, its moods, the way it behaved under different weather, the sounds it made at night that were normal and the sounds that weren't. She had learned it through her hands and her feet and her accumulated hours of working inside it, and that kind of knowledge was different from any other kind. It sat in the body rather than the head. She had also been thinking, with increasing frequency, about what Rowan had said at the fence in November. I don't want you to leave. Not when the debt's worked off. Not ever, if you're willing. She had not responded to the full weight of it then. She had said, I know and meant it, but meaning something and doing something about it were different acts. And she had been sitting with the distance between them for 3 weeks, in the way she sat with difficult things. Not avoiding, exactly, but letting them become what they were going to be before she decided. What was making it difficult was not Rowan. He had done exactly what he had done from the beginning, which was to say what he meant, and then wait without pressure for the world to catch up to it. What was making it difficult was Evelyn herself. The specific tangle of a woman who had been made self-sufficient by necessity and had been self-sufficient for long enough that depending on anyone felt like a structural risk, like adding a load-bearing wall to a house you'd already learned to stand in without it. She understood intellectually that this was fear wearing the clothing of practicality. She had understood it for some time. Understanding it and moving past it were two different things. It was May who moved it, not by being gentle about it. It was a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, and Evelyn was at the kitchen counter and May was at the table with her coffee, and there was nothing in particular happening except that the silence between them had the particular quality that sometimes preceded May saying something she had been holding for a while. "You're going to make yourself miserable," May said, "if you keep treating something good like it's something you need to verify for another 6 months before you trust it." Evelyn turned around. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." May drank her coffee. Her expression was its usual compact neutrality. "I've been watching people make this mistake my whole life. They get the thing they need, and then they stand just outside of it in case it turns out to be wrong, and they're so busy protecting themselves from the possibility of it being wrong that they never actually have it." Evelyn looked at her. "He's not a complicated man," May said. "He's exactly what he looks like. In 30 years of knowing people, that's a rarer thing than you'd think." "You've known him 30 years?" "I knew his mother, watched him grow up." A pause. "He's not perfect. He's stubborn, and he doesn't talk enough, and he keeps things in his own head longer than is useful, but what he says he means. That's not nothing." "I know it's not nothing," Evelyn said. "Then stop standing outside of it," May said, and picked up her coffee again, and that appeared to be the end of the conversation, because May did not believe in drawing things out past their necessary length. Evelyn turned back to the counter. She stood there for a moment. Then she set down what she was holding and went to find Rowan. He was in the barn, as he usually was in the early morning, doing the first check of the day. She found him at the far end, running his hand along the shoulder of the bay, who had come to them badly handled and who was, after 2 months, almost a different animal. Still watchful, still not entirely convinced, but no longer trembling at the approach of a hand. Rowan looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he read most things, quickly, without making a production of it. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. "At the fence." "I figured," he said. "I'm not going to tell you I'm not scared," she said. "I am. I probably will be for a while." "All right." "But I've been letting the fear make my decisions, and I'm tired of it." She paused. "I'm not going to leave when the debt's worked off. I want to stay." He looked at her steadily. The bay stood between them with the patience of an animal that had learned waiting was not always a precursor to pain. "And the rest of it?" he asked. "I want the rest of it too," she said. "If it still stands." He set his hand flat against the bay's neck, the same slow, deliberate gesture she had watched him make 100 times. "It stands," he said. She nodded. He nodded. The bay breathed out through his nose with the slow, satisfied sound of an animal at rest. It was not a moment from a romance. It was two people in a working barn on a cold December morning, both of them marked by difficulty, agreeing on something that mattered. She would take it over the other kind of moment without hesitation. Touch. May died on the 14th of December. She went in her sleep, which was what she would have chosen if she had been given the choice, and which was, in the way of some things, a mercy that came without warning. Evelyn found her in the morning when she didn't come to the kitchen at her usual hour, and the stillness in May's room was the particular stillness that had nothing ordinary in it. She stood in the doorway of May's room and she let herself feel the weight of it without immediately doing anything about it, which was the only honest response to that kind of stillness. Then she closed the door gently and went to find Rowan. He heard the news with the expression of a man absorbing something he had known was coming and had not been ready for anyway. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was unusual for him, and was quiet for a long minute. "She was ready," he said finally. "She said so last week. I didn't think she was talking about this week." "She didn't seem like she was," Evelyn said. She sat across from him. "She was teaching Clara to fold pastry yesterday." Something moved across his face. "That sounds right," he said. "She wouldn't have left it half done." They sat with that for a moment. "She was the closest thing I had to family here," he said. It came out matter of fact, which was its own kind of ache. "I know," Evelyn said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held it, and they sat in the kitchen in the early morning cold while the ranch woke up around them, and Evelyn thought about May Sutton, who had been sharp and unsentimental, and had never once said anything she didn't mean, and who had taught her granddaughter to fold pastry the day before she died, as if there were things worth passing on, and not enough time to be particular about who you passed them to. It was, she thought, a way to live. It was not a bad way to live at all. Clara cried in the particular devastating way of small children who have lost someone they have adopted as their own. She had not understood about Thomas's death, had processed it in the incomplete, instinctive way of a 3-year-old, but she was 5 now, and she had spent 4 months beside May in that kitchen, and she understood this. Evelyn held her and let her cry without trying to fix it, because some things needed to be felt before they could be carried. Silas was very quiet for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he asked if he could have one of May's kitchen cloths, the worn blue one she used for bread, that had her flower handprints on it from years of use. Evelyn said yes. Silas took it without comment and put it in the box from Harlan Creek, alongside Thomas's letters, and Evelyn saw him do this and understood, with a clarity that brought its own complicated grief, that her son was learning, at 7 years old, to make a collection of what mattered from the people he had lost. Some lessons came too early. There was nothing to be done about it except make sure they weren't learned alone. She sat beside him that evening, and he leaned against her without being asked, the way he had on the porch in November, the rare and precious closeness he was already beginning to outgrow. "She was good to us," he said. "She was," Evelyn agreed. "She didn't have to be." "No, she chose to be." A pause. "That's the better kind." He thought about this. Outside, the December wind moved against the house with its low, cold voice. "Mr. Vale is like that too," he said. "He chose." Evelyn looked at the lamp on the table. "Yes," she said. "He did." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "If you married him, I wouldn't call him Papa. I want you to know that already." "I know. That's all right." "I'd call him—" He considered. "I don't know yet. Something that means what it means without meaning the other thing." "That's fair," she said. "You'll find it when the time comes." He nodded with the gravity of someone filing a decision made. Then he closed his eyes against her shoulder, and within 10 minutes was asleep with the total commitment of the deeply exhausted, and Evelyn sat still and held him and watched the lamp burn. It was 3 days after May's burial, on a gray afternoon that couldn't decide between snow and rain, that Rowan came inside earlier than usual and found Evelyn in the kitchen. The children were in the back room, Clara napping, Silas reading, Henry dismantling something small with the focused determination he brought to all projects of destruction and discovery. The house was quiet in the hollow way it had been since May's room went empty. Rowan stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and snow damp on his hat, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one that preceded something he had been carrying long enough that he had decided to put it down. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned from the stove. "All right." He took off his hat. This was, she had noted over 4 months, a specific gesture for him. He didn't remove his hat indoors unless he was at the table, and this was something else. It was the gesture of a man approaching something he wanted to approach properly. "I know the timing is—" He stopped, started again. "May dying changed things, the way any loss changes things. It reminded me that I've been waiting for the right moment, and there's no right moment. There's just the moments you have and what you do with them." She was very still. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not will you." The asking came a beat later. "I want to marry you, and I want to be a fair man to your children for as long as I have the chance to be. And I want this house to be a real home for all of you, not a situation you're surviving." He paused. "I'm not going to promise perfect. I'm going to promise present. I'll be here, and I'll do right by you, and if I fall short of that, I want you to tell me and I'll correct it." Another pause. "Will you marry me?" It came out almost as a statement which was so completely him that she could have laughed, except that she was not in a laughing place. She was in a place that was quieter and deeper than that, a place inside herself where the things that actually mattered lived without much decoration. She thought for one moment about August. The auction block and the sun and the town that had known her for 9 years and come out to watch and not to help. She thought about Gerald Fitch and his brass nameplate and his apologies that were really just procedures. She thought about Corbin Dale looking at her 7-year-old boy and seeing arithmetic. She thought about a man on a gray horse, trail dusty and unhurried, who had paid a debt, not because it was strategic, but because he had a sister once and there had been no one at her auction. She had spent 4 months learning who Rowan Vale was, and she knew him now. Not completely, because people were not completable, but well enough. Well enough to know that the word present in his mouth meant something specific and serious, that it was not the word he had chosen because it sounded right, but because it was the most accurate description of what he was offering. He would be there. He would show up. He would pay attention and not make noise about it, and do the daily, undramatic, essential work of actually being a person you could count on. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that told her he had not been as certain as he'd looked. Silas will need time, she said. He knows it might happen. He won't call you Papa. He shouldn't have to. Clara will be easier. Henry won't remember a before. I know. And I'm going to have bad days, she said. Days where the grief is louder than the rest of it, and I'm not easy to be around. I've seen your bad days, he said. I'm still here. She looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and snow damp on his shoulders, and the particular steady look that was just his face, the face that had been outside for most of its life, and had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Then yes, she said again, let's not wait. Something in his expression settled, the way a house settles when the foundation is right. Not dramatically, just completely. There's a minister in Colby, he said. I know there is. We could go Saturday. We could. That's soon. Yes, she said. It is. He came into the kitchen. He crossed to where she was standing, and he was not a man who made gestures. She had learned this. So when he took her face in both his hands, she understood the weight of it. And when he kissed her, it was not the dramatic kiss of a man trying to prove something, but the careful, deliberate kiss of a man who had finally arrived somewhere he had been working toward and intended to remember it. She put her hands over his and felt the roughness of them, the honest roughness of hands that had worked hard in cold and heat and everything in between. When they stepped back from each other, neither of them said anything for a moment. Then, from the back room, Clara's voice floated down the hall with the pitch of someone just waking from a nap and checking whether the world was still where she'd left it. Mama? I'm here, Evelyn called back. She looked at Rowan. He looked at her. And there it was, small and undramatic and completely real, the ordinary domestic moment on the other side of everything that had been survived to get here. The child's voice and the answer, and the man standing in the kitchen, and the stove that needed to be checked, and the work that would still be there tomorrow and the day after, and all the days that followed. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. They were married on a Saturday in December, 8 days before Christmas, in the minister's parlor in Colby, with no audience except Cal Doss standing as Rowan's witness, with his arms still in the wrap she had made him, and the expression of a man who had decided to find the day moving and wasn't going to apologize for it. Danny had come too, quiet as always, standing near the wall in his good shirt with his distant eyes more present than usual. Silas stood beside his mother during the short ceremony with his arms at his sides and his expression doing the complicated work of holding more than one thing at the same time. He did not smile, exactly, but he was present in the full sense of the word, not somewhere else, not behind the wall he had built and maintained with such diligence since August. He was there, watching, filing it away in whatever internal record he was keeping of what his life was becoming. Clara held Henry's hand to keep him from investigating the minister's bookshelf, a task that required her full attention and which she executed with the focused authority she had inherited from a woman who had pressed bread dough and taught her what mattered without ever saying it was important. When the minister pronounced them married, Rowan looked at Evelyn the way he looked at things that mattered to him. Directly, without embellishment, with the full weight of his attention. She looked back. She was aware of her heart doing something irregular, which she considered fair given the circumstances. It was Silas who surprised her. After it was done, when they were on the porch of the minister's house gathering coats and hats for the cold outside, Silas walked up to Rowan and stood in front of him with the particular squared-up posture he used for things he had decided needed to be said directly. Rowan looked down at him. "I've been thinking about what to call you," Silas said. "Have you? Papa doesn't fit. Sir is too far the other way." He paused. "My father's name was Thomas. I'm not going to use that." Another pause, shorter this time. "Could I call you Rowan?" Something moved across Rowan Vale's face that was not quite any single emotion, but was made of several, layered. He crouched down to eye level, the way he had done in the paddock months ago, the way he did with things he wanted to meet at their actual height. "You can call me anything you want," he said. "Rowan is fine." Silas nodded. He had the expression of someone who has executed a difficult task correctly and is not going to make more of it than it was. "Okay," he said, and went to find his coat. Rowan stayed crouched for a moment after Silas walked away. Evelyn, watching, saw him put a hand briefly to his eyes in the way of a man who is not going to cry, but has needed a moment. Then he stood up and put his hat on and was himself again, and she said nothing about it, because some things were private even between people who had agreed to be honest with each other. She took his hand as they walked to the wagon, and he held it, and Cal pretended to look at something in the other direction with excessive interest, and that was their wedding. The drive back to the ranch was 40 miles and took most of the afternoon, and the children fell asleep in the wagon bed before they were 10 miles out, Clara with her head on Silas's shoulder in the way she did when she stopped fighting her own tiredness, and Henry, a small round shape between them, wrapped in the spare blanket. Evelyn sat on the bench beside Rowan in the cold, and the wide Kansas sky was doing the thing it sometimes did in winter, laying down horizontal bands of color along the horizon as the sun dropped, pale gold at the base and blue above, and everything between those 2 points in the arrangement that the sky made without asking anyone's permission. "I've been thinking about May," she said. She told me the morning before I talked to you. She said I was standing outside the thing instead of being in it." She paused. "She was right." "She was usually right," Rowan said. "She just didn't feel the need to be loud about it." "No." Evelyn looked at the horizon. "She knew this was going to happen, I think, before she died. I think she made sure of some things before she went." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Teaching Clara the pastry, and talking to me that morning." She paused. "She wasn't a sentimental woman." "No. But she did the sentimental things when they needed doing. She just didn't announce them." Rowan guided the horses around a patch of rough ground with the automatic ease of a man who had made this journey 100 times. "She would have liked to see it," he said, "today." "I think she did see it," Evelyn said, and she said it without any particular mysticism, just as a woman who believed that the people who had shaped you carried forward in the things you did, and that May Sutton had pressed her flour-stained hands into this day as surely as she had pressed them into the bread dough she had made every morning for 30 years. Rowan looked ahead down the road. "I'm going to need to find someone for the kitchen," he said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. "Not yet." "No, not yet." She looked at him. "I know you can manage," he said. "That was never the question." The wagon rolled northwest through the December afternoon, and the sky darkened by degrees above the flat grassland, and the cold deepened in the way of winter evenings that meant business. And somewhere in the wagon bed Silas shifted in his sleep, and Clara made a small sound and settled again. She thought about Harlan Creek. She thought about Gerald Fitch, and his sealed envelopes, and his professional apologies. She thought about standing on that auction block in her good blue dress with Henry on her hip, looking out at a crowd of people who had known her for 9 years and were not going to help her. She thought about the geometry of desperation, how it narrowed everything down to the single point of what you could not lose, and how sometimes, in that narrowing, you found out what you were actually made of. She had not known, in August, what she was made of, or rather she had suspected, but suspicion was not the same as proof. She knew now. She was made of the same thing her children were made of. The willingness to keep going after the ground gave way, not because it was heroic or because there was a particular reward for it, but because stopping was not a real option when there were people who needed you to keep going. She was made of 9 years of a marriage that had been good and plain and had ended too soon and had given her 3 children who were, each in their own way, extraordinary. She was made of 2 months on an auction block and 40 miles of prairie and a kitchen that had become hers, and a ranch she had learned with her hands. And she was now made of this. The wagon seat and the December sky and the man beside her who had paid a debt not to own her, but to keep a family from being taken apart, and who had spent 4 months earning what he had always been offering. That was not a small thing. People did not do that generally. People drove past auction blocks without stopping, and people let strangers be taken apart by debt and circumstance, and it was considered normal, considered just the way things went. Rowan Vale had stopped. That was not the whole of who he was, but it was the first true fact she had known about him, and 4 months later she still considered it among the most important. The ranch came into view in the last light, the fence line first, then the outbuildings, then the house, its windows dark because there was no May to leave a lamp burning. She would put the lamp on herself when they got in. She would get the stove going and heat whatever was left from the morning's cooking, and the children would wake up hungry and tired and would need managing, and Rowan would see to the horses, and Cal would come in from the bunkhouse eventually, and the ranch would be the ranch with all its requirements and all its rhythms and all its plain, unfinished reality. It was not the life she had planned. She had planned a different life, built on different ground, with different hands to come home to. But plans were made before you knew everything, and sometimes what came instead of what you'd planned was not lesser, just different, shaped by different forces, earned in different ways. She had not planned this ranch, or these people, or this man beside her. She had not planned any of it, and it was hers now, in the way that things become yours through effort and grief and the daily decision to show up. She had once been sold under a merciless sun. She was going home now in the dark, to her own house. That distance between those two facts was not measurable in miles. Rowan pulled the wagon through the gate and stopped it in the yard, and she climbed down before he could come around, because she had been climbing down from wagons on her own since before he knew her name, and that was not a thing that changed. He met her at the back of the wagon, and they lifted the sleeping children out together. Clara handed down with her arms loose and heavy in the way of deep sleep. Henry scooped up by Rowan with a practiced ease that Henry didn't even register. Silas rousing enough to walk with his eyes mostly closed and one hand on his mother's arm for direction. They went inside. Evelyn lit the lamp. Rowan set Henry in his crib and came back to help Silas out of his coat, and Silas let him, half asleep, with the uncomplicated trust of total exhaustion. She watched this from across the room and said nothing. The stove went back on. The house warmed. The horses were seen to. The ordinary work of an ordinary evening on a working ranch in December moved through its paces without drama or ceremony, and that was right. That was how it should be. The meaningful things did not always announce themselves. They showed up in the same clothes as everything else, and you had to be paying attention to notice them. She was paying attention. She had been paying attention since August, since a blistering auction block and a stranger on a gray horse, and the first morning she had woken up on this ranch and understood that survival was not the same as living, but was, sometimes, how you got there. Later, when the children were down and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee, and Rowan sat across from her, and the lamp was low between them, and there was nothing particular to say, which was fine, because they had learned how to be in a room together without filling the silence with things that didn't need saying. Outside, the December wind moved against the house with its low, cold voice. Inside, the stove held steady. She thought about what she would tell her children someday, when they were old enough for the full version. She would tell them that the worst moment she had ever lived, standing on that platform, watching a crowd calculate the price of her family, had also been, in a way she could not have understood at the time, the beginning of something. Not because suffering had a purpose, not because pain was a down payment on something better. She didn't believe in that kind of arithmetic. She would tell them instead that people were capable of ordinary, extraordinary things, that a man could see a family about to be broken apart and decide for no reason the world would call practical to stop it, that a woman could walk into a stranger's house with 3 children and nothing else and build something real there through the plain, unglamorous currency of work and honesty and the refusal to stop caring even when caring was expensive. That a 7-year-old boy could hold 2 true things at once, grief and the future, loss and the willingness to try again, with more grace than most adults managed in a lifetime. She would tell them that love, the real kind, did not announce itself with music, It showed up in fence repairs and medical boxes and hard candy on a kitchen table, and a man who waited without pressure and meant what he said and did not try to be someone he wasn't. She would tell them that family was not only the people you were born to, it was also sometimes the people who saw you at your worst and your most desperate and stayed anyway, and earned the right to stay through the only currency that actually held its value, showing up day after day in the ordinary and the catastrophic both, and being who they said they were. She looked at Rowan Vale across the kitchen table in the low lamplight. He was not a perfect man. He kept things in his head too long. He was not always easy to read. He would forget things, make wrong calls, have his own limitations that she had not fully encountered yet, and would have to find her own way around when she did. She was not a perfect woman. She was still afraid sometimes, still calculating exit routes out of old habit, still prone to the locked room at the back of herself that she had filled with things that were too heavy to carry and too important to put down. She would have her bad days, and her unreachable ones, and her days when the grief was louder than the rest of it. They were going to be, between them, imperfect. That was fine. Imperfect things could still stand. Imperfect things, in fact, sometimes stood the longest, because they had been built by people who understood that the cracks were part of it, that nothing real came without them. She had been sold under a merciless sun in August. It was December now, and she was warm, and her children were asleep, and the lamp was steady between them. That was not luck. That was not fate. That was the accumulated weight of 100 ordinary decisions. To keep going, to be honest, to stay afraid and do the thing anyway, to accept that some things could not be controlled and some things could, and the work was knowing the difference. She picked up her cup. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you," he said. "I know." She didn't move yet. The lamp burned between them. The wind moved outside. The ranch held steady in the winter dark, all of it. The horses and the pasture and the good fence and the gray wooden house that was her house now, hers and her children's and this man's, built by years of work before she arrived and by 4 months of her own since. She set down the cup. She stood up. He stood up too. They put out the lamp together, and the kitchen went dark. And outside, the Kansas night was cold and wide and full of everything that the morning would bring, the work and the difficulty and the ordinary beauty of a life that had been made from the pieces of a harder one. And that was enough. It was, when she let herself feel the full weight of it without flinching, more than enough. It was everything.